Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Bored Out of Our Minds, brought to you by Team Emerald Fire, me, Emerald Drago.
And me, Hellfire Bam. Today's episode will be about getting to your first playtest, different design philosophies, how to get started, all these sorts of things. When Emerald and I discussed making this podcast, we wanted to also use it as a way to document our growth as designers. It's been almost 3 years since we've met, and we've grown a long way. And we know that there are a lot of other people, especially during COVID time, who might be interested in finally finding the time to get into game design. And so they can kind of see, hey, there are other people just like me at my level who are learning to do it. Maybe I can do it too. So we just want to try to inspire people, and everyone is learning together. If we can get more people watching and participating and giving their own feedback, we can all learn together, and that would be awesome. I really want to try to grow a community and that sort of thing. So, okay, we'll try to get started in terms of design philosophies and ways to kind of approach introducing your game.
So, importantly, this episode hopefully isn't going to be as rambly as the first one. The general creative process is a very important and divisive point on which people create their games, and each different design philosophy can bring, obviously, completely different game designs.
And so we'll first talk about what details might differentiate different designers. So certain designers might value different things. So that could be either what is the goal of what they want people to gain experience-wise from playing a game. So some people, they like to focus their designs around very fun, interactive experiences. Others like to add some sort of story quality or being able to make a crazy narrative out of the events of a game state or what's going on in the game. And others still, they want to be able to really flex their muscles, have some sort of puzzle, really make people toil over the decisions that they're making throughout the game, really have that strategy. That's going to be for those deeper war games, those games that might be like 4X games or just very intense games that are memorable for that different way because they make your brain bleed, but in a good way because we love it.
Yes. First of all, it's important to stratify which various types of game design there are. So, as Hellfire mentioned, 4X is a very specific and very intense kind of game because it requires a lot of bookkeeping, usually, a lot of intense
through paths and just tactics.
Yeah,
we can quickly explain. Let's look up the four. So 4X is because there's four words that start with the sound phonetically X. Let me go ahead and look it up because I always forget. It is explore, expand, exploit, exterminate. So essentially, these are all player mechanics that you'll be doing throughout the game. Explore being when you're starting off the game, you try to get the lay of the land. Expand, you move your units across the land. Exploit, you get resources from the sort of thing. Exterminate, you use your resources to leverage them into ways to screw everyone else over. So you're the last one standing.
Yeah. So this is a very intense type of game, and usually it takes hours of play, depending on which type of game which game specifically you're playing. This is obviously not a directly comfy game to be playing. It's one that...
Yeah, and certain people, it's not going to be very approachable to most audiences. So knowing your audience is another very important thing. So go on.
Yes. I guess from that point, we can go on to the gacha or take that type games, which are mostly on the other end of the spectrum. Take that games are usually very interactive and very tense types of games.
And to be clear, they tend to try to make their game feel like anyone can win at any time. The people who are at the top can always lose everything. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. There's a lot of excitement to it. Unlike other games that might be called like Euro games or that sort of thing, where if a person who's experienced in the game has a good lead, it will not be very likely that they'll lose it all of a sudden due to one interaction. if they know what they're doing. So in Take That games, the intent is for everyone to feel like they're still in the game to the best of the ability. And now sometimes that can be due to luck. So high variance can sometimes be a factor that can actually make people who are of a lower skill do better or just straight up win games that they shouldn't have otherwise won. And it's for more competitive players now, they're not going to like that. But for people who just want to stay in the game, some players, they feel awful if they feel like, well, I have no chance. My strategy failed. I just wanted to play a fun strategy. I just wanted to troll my friends and do something wacky. These players will feel alienated if they're trying to play a super serious game that has fewer take that mechanics. So when you're designing your game, you're going to have to figure out who's my audience, what type of experience and what kind of emotions am I trying to evoke out of my players.
So from this point, identifying your player base and identifying who you're planning on playing with, who you're planning on testing the game with, etc., it's important to know what type of design you're going with going forward and if that interests certain groups. So an important design factor is bottom up or top down. This identifies either flavor first or mechanics first design. So imagine it as a slice of jelly toast. Bottom up means that you're getting the crunchy stuff first. You're getting all the deep mechanics first. Top down means that you're getting all the flavor first. So you're getting all of the storyline and all of the very specific nuances of characters before you're actually building the game.
So that might be, for example, you might be starting off. Let's say I want to make a game where we're all vampires. What kind of game would that be? Okay, I think it would probably be some sort of arena game where the vampires are hunting down the humans. Okay, so now I just created mechanics around this vision of vampires hunting humans. Now, what if I wanted to play a game instead where I'm like, I want to make a game that's specifically, well, because I can come to that very same conclusion, but from reverse. Let's say I want to make a game where I want to have a really strong character who's hunting down other ones. Okay, so now that I have that mechanic, how do I dress that up and make it interesting? So, okay, let's say we have vampire, right? We just went back in full circle the other way. So now we started off with, I want to be able to have a player who feels powerful and hunts down other people. Oh, hey, that kind of sounds like a vampire hunting down humans. And I just went back to the other way, to the same thing that I said the other way. So you can do that. You can get to the same conclusion, but the different ways can change your perception on what you value in terms of how you get started in your design.
Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that either way is better than the other or that one way is entirely illegitimate. Both of these are entirely legitimate forms of game design that will be used forever because it's just how games are made most of the time is you choose one or you choose both and you just make the game as it is in making your own slice of whatever you decide to do. Right. Going forward, the types of games that we've created are mostly bottom up, I'd say, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we haven't had top down designs.
A lot of the times our games are very mechanics driven in nature, and we like to make certain restrictions to ourselves to try to breed creativity in terms of what if we tried making challenges for ourselves. So we say, what if we try to make a deck builder with X mechanic or with a market that's like this, etc., etc. It kind of evokes that feeling of how early video game designers were, especially like musicians at the time. They were very limited with their 8-bit palette of what they had, and so that naturally made some masterpieces. You got your Kondo, you got your Mario music, you got your Zelda music, all of that, and it was all bred out of their limitations. So sometimes just doing that, having all the freedom in the world, it's just like analysis of paralysis, but for the designer, right? So sometimes having artificial restrictions for yourself can make you think outside of the box.
Right. And it's very important to find some sort of restriction when you start developing to truly develop forward your game, because usually having a full breadth and depth of view as far as a designer goes can be very intimidating, and bottlenecking yourself down to a specific theme or a specific design mechanic can vastly improve your overall output.
That is also to say, it can be very sad to hear have to tell people, hey, don't go too wild, too imaginative. As much as everyone wants to be the next new trendsetter, it's a little bit ill-advised to go way too outside the boundaries of what's accepted, because you just might not find an audience or anyone who's willing to accept it. So sometimes playing safe can help, just to try to ground yourself a little bit.
It's also important, while you want to find an audience and you want to breed a certain audience for your game, not to make yourself go too wild and too out there because you might not find an audience, but also don't make your game too dull. Because while there's a design space that's important for certain players who want a simple game, making your game way too simple could be disastrous in the other spectrum, because then you can end up finding nobody.
Right, and to be clear, no one intends to make their game dull. So the ways that might happen might just be if you're afraid of overly balancing your game to the point that the gameplay becomes extremely stale, because either it's easy to figure out how to beat the game, and you might run into things that are called optimal strategies, or just other factors like that. People like to have variance in how they approach playing a game. You want to be able to pick up the game and try a new strategy, for instance. That helps bring about a sort of a meta game. We discussed that before in the previous episode, and also has emergent gameplay. So some games have more elements of randomness and variance than others, and having to play around that can be exhilarating at times. So some people think randomness is always a bad thing, but if it brings out new avenues of play that you otherwise wouldn't have had to think about, that's good.
Right. And that also brings up another topic, which is push your luck games. Push your luck games are routinely postured as some of the most technical and some of the most brain dead games, because depending on how you develop it, the push your luck could be roll this die any number of times, and if you hit a 6, you win. It could be that simple, but that's not interesting gameplay.
Right. There's really very little decision points there, unless there's some crazy consequences that are all lined up. But yeah, go ahead.
Right. Another push a luck game that I kind of like, which it also is fairly simple, but in a different way, is Megaland. Megaland is a game where the whole premise of how you build your resources is by flipping cards from a deck. And each time that you do, it's either a monster or an obstacle or something. And you have to spend jump points to jump over something, or you take damage from it. So you start off with like 3 hits, and each time you flip, you either get nothing resources or a monster that just hits you. So you have to determine when it is that you want to stop, because if you don't stop and you die, then you just lose all your resources that you would have gotten, which is a very punishing type of gameplay.
So I'm not familiar with this gameplay. Are there ways to be able to foresee what's coming ahead? Are there ways to kind of prepare for the worst? How does the game kind of compensate?
Preparing for the worst, you have jump points, which allow you to completely skip a monster if you end up hitting it and you would have died. That's one of the only ways where you can do it. But other than that, there's no real way to know what's coming up. It's all based on luck.
Gotcha.
So it's a very simple game, but
Okay.
the way you build points is by building buildings, which get you different resources, and you can modulate your way of building certain resources. Like there's a bunny that one of the resources is eggs. So if you have eggs and you give them, or wait, no, there's eggs and carrots, and if you give carrots to the rabbit, then he just goes away, and you don't have to deal with him. So that's another way of potentially circumventing certain dangers that you would have not normally.
So, when you're starting off, I would recommend trying to keep things pretty simple, and you can kind of add spice to the gameplay. You want to try to keep iterate. So we'll talk a little bit about iteration cycles and how you should approach playtesting and improving your demo. So I would recommend trying to keep and isolate what variables you have to tweak that will change the gameplay and experience of the game. So the more that you're able to isolate a few at a time, then as you add in more mechanics, you can start to kind of turn on and turn off, toggle different mechanics and try to help tweak what you're doing. And you won't feel so overwhelmed all the time because there's not like a bunch of different things you're having to balance.
Right. And we had actually mentioned a ton of deck builders, both TCG and regular form deck builders that you build your deck
Right.
over time. In the last game, those games are some of the most difficult to pin down because not only do you have a bunch of core mechanics, but you also have a bunch of individual card mechanics that could end up fluctuating over time, and it's very hard to isolate variables. Isolating variables of your game is one of the most important things to do when it comes to fixing a problem, but it's also one of the most important things to do in terms of knowing if a mechanic is fun or not, or if it fits in your game. This could be either taking a specific card and increasing the number of copies of it in a game to know that you're going to see it more and see if it tests well, or just taking out certain cards entirely if you want to focus in on a single card mechanic. This is also done for sets of cards or entire mechanics sometimes, because individualizing mechanics is a important factor for balancing your game. So if there are extraneous mechanics, you want to eliminate those.
So if you have problems, I would recommend trying to start from micro and go out macro in terms of your scope of what you're looking at changing. So say there's a card that you think might be very overpowered or overtuned and is giving too much power to a player. You might want to first check maybe the number of copies of this card in distribution, different things like that. Try to just get as many data points as possible about strategies and games that are able to incorporate this card. So because some abilities or some things are considered overpowered, or because they're only exclusively extremely powerful in a very difficult to set up circumstance, which is usually accepted by players. If it's something that doesn't happen every single game, but it's insane in the game that it happens, that's usually accepted. But if it's something that can happen every single game and the person who goes for it immediately swings the game, then that's a problem that you have, and that's when you have to start relooking at it. Other times it could be, maybe it's not necessarily the fact that this card itself is overpowered. Maybe it's its placement relative to the other cards that are in play or something like that. So sometimes relative power level, looking at a power curve of... So do you want to explain what a power curve is in general?
Right. A power curve generally is where a card places in your current metagame of what you've built. So for instance, a high power monster that is very cheap is very, very high on the power curve because it breaks the conventions of the game.
Right. So you want to start off from a relative baseline, very few abilities, but like things. So you'll have like a standard, and then you'll have things that are below standard in certain aspects, such as in Magic the Gathering, like we've discussed, the two mana 2/2 bear is like your bog standard sort of thing. And so when you have things that it's a 2 mana 3/3, oh, this is slightly above curve, or oh, this card is a 2 mana 1/1, it's slightly below curve in that matter. If that just existed on its own, it would be terrible. So we should probably give it some sort of buff or some sort of effect to compensate for its abilities being lower. So you're going to want to keep a track, and you might use spreadsheets or even more robust techniques for doing this to try to track the general power level of all the mechanics that you have, It doesn't have to be cards. It could be actions. It could be just all these sort of things. You want to make sure that there isn't one action, one card, one strategy that's easier to invest in or is always feels like the right choice to pick every single time. Because people like variety, people like to feel clever because they're thinking of new ways of trying to game the game, so to speak. So that's a really important thing. If you can design a game where you thought of a lot of the different strategies, but the player felt like they cheated the game and you thought of it, you are in such a winning position because now you've made the players feel like a genius, and that is something that people love to feel. They love to feel good about themselves. They love to feel like they figured something out. So that is what I would recommend trying to aim for. Opportunities like that can be very powerful, although it comes at a risk of just having too explosive gameplay or having it could just be an exploit that completely ruins the balance of the game. So try to look out for making and curating moments like that, but be careful if it's too easy to make this moment or if it makes other players not have less fun.
Right now, I'd like to pinpoint some specific creative processes or design philosophies that we all have. So, for instance, I'm a very mechanics first, but still keeping flavor in mind type of philosopher. I like to make a lot of grand ideas that I usually don't end up following up on. But I also like to make some relatively simple games, but they usually end up getting a little bit out of hand.
Yeah. I would say that Emerald and I got along pretty well because we really enjoyed marrying mechanics to flavor and that sort of thing. But we also always kind of saw eye to eye. Like once we found a mechanic that grabbed us, we would immediately just start drilling it home exactly what we wanted to do with that. And then once the flavor started getting injected, we would start to figure out how do we make this feel like it's accurately representing the actions that we're having the players do in their head. What is going on? How do we paint a picture of what's happening when I cast this card, or what's happening when I perform this action? And so it was a really easy way for us to get along. There were times though where we would have our differences in terms of different mechanics. So sometimes I might want to have a more strategically rich mechanic that might be a little bit too difficult for starting players to play, and sometimes we would have our differences, but you have to try to figure out that sort of thing. Other times just I would find that my ability to I just have really good experience being kind of a rules lawyer. I have a lot of experience reading a lot of different rule books. I tend to be the person who knows how to get that wording right, that really edge cases get covered. So those are individual instances during your game that rarely happen, but when it does happen, people want to know what the answer is so that you can move on. So sometimes if a players get stuck and they don't know what to do and they go to the rules and they don't know what to do, then there's panic. So
Right. That's most of what. That's mostly why I like having Hellfire around, is because I am terrible at coming up with specific wordings and specific corner cases, specific corner case interaction like identifiers.
Welcome to Emerald Fire teaches you how to be a social butterfly.
Really. In total.
How to get along with people.
In total, it's usually good to just reach out to somebody because they might end up working like we do. We end up complimenting each other and ending up making some pretty decent games, we like to think. But
yeah.
So going forward, your idea of where you want to go with your game is very important, but getting a playtest in is one of the most important. It is probably the most important step, actually, of making your game, because otherwise you have literally no basis from where to build, and if you try to build a game without playtesting, you are going to have a really hard time. Trust me. So it's important to know where you can find your playtesters. That's part of the reason why we're trying to make a community, is because we'd like to have more playtesters openly available to everybody, and having a outlet to discuss with other people about game design is extremely important. That's why there are so many different forums on Discord, Reddit, basically anywhere.
Or even a site like Board Game Arena or Board Game Geek. These are all ways for people in a community to be able to think about a singular idea and try to come at it from every angle, because you're never going to be able to come at it from every angle yourself, and especially you won't be able to figure out everything on paper or theoretically speaking. Everyone wants to say that they're good at balancing games, but there's always going to be those edge cases or crazy combination of events that you won't foresee.
And importantly, some other people might not see it, so you have to regularly comb your ideas and figure out where your mistakes are. Not saying that you're definitely going to catch some of them. There are a lot of cases where a game is shipped or a game is made free for print and play or that various kind of thing, and it just crumbles because it has a flaw that nobody saw in playtesting, which is why playtesting is so important. So finding people to playtest, we mentioned Reddit and other Discord servers, but one of the most important pieces of design software right now is Tabletop Simulator. We had mentioned it in the previous podcast briefly, and I added a link. I would be adding a link to this one too, because it's currently $10 on Steam, which is half the price, which is awesome. And I highly recommend, if you're listening to this podcast, go out and get it now. Like, stop the podcast, go buy it, because you're going to want that if you're making any kind of game. Or if you're not even making games, to just play other games, because that's the best place to import your various designs and just playtest them with literally anybody online. With COVID time now, which is still happening, even though we just recorded 2 weeks ago, like, obviously it's still happening, you have so much potential in Tabletop Simulator that it would be dumb not to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, it gives us a way to actually be able to play with to actually have game sessions. And, people have been using Zoom for a little while to play some types of games, but with TTS, you can play all the types of games.
Yeah, and you can import. I'm fairly certain there's Gloomhaven on there. There's Twilight Imperium. There's very intensive games.
And the coolest thing that people do is they'll put Kickstarter games or games that are just about to go on Kickstarter, and they let you demo the games. And it's a great way for people who are trying to put their game up on Kickstarter to give people a flavor of what they can expect. And also to get some initial feedback on how they can inform the rest of their design leading into post initial Kickstarter.
And while Tabletop Simulator is such an important point of game design, if you have anybody in your immediate social circle that you are able to play your game with, that's also important. Like, I playtest with my mother sometimes, and she has a hard time grasping some mechanics, but she gives a lot of important feedback that I wouldn't get from other players. Same goes with Hellfire.
Right. That's important. We discussed in the last episode about how designers can have a cognitive bias. Some ideas that, because you've been acquainted and constantly hearing and interacting with these sort of things, it'll feel natural to you. It'll feel obvious to you. It might feel like common sense, but that's not always the case. And we talked about how people have different game experiences. And so you want to be able to find as diverse an audience as possible, which is what TTS enables you to do. You get to play with complete strangers. And that's very scary sometimes. And especially it's encouraged to eventually get into blind playtesting for when you want to test out your rules. So blind playtesting means you're not going to be there to be the coach or the umpire or the person who's regulating the rules. You're just a silent observer watching people play the game and figure out the rules based on reading your rule set, what they would do. You have to pretend like they took this game home and they opened it up and they're figuring it out. And it's a very scary process, but now I think more than ever you can do that. You can post, hey, these are my rules, this is my print and play. You can print out all this stuff. There you go. And now with TTS, it's even easier. You just put it on the workshop. You make your mod public, and I've seen people do that. There's this game on Kickstarter right now that's very successful called Bullet Hearts that Emerald and I were playing, and it's very cool that people are designers are catching on to this. It's a really good marketing
Bullet
play.
Hearts is a very good game, and you should probably play it. Um, yeah, I really like Bullet Hearts because it has a style in its gameplay and a niche that I would love more of.
So first of all, to return to what we were talking about, that is a definite top bottom game. It is inspired by bullet hell games. So games like Toho. These are anime inspired. These are very popular fan games, or no, not really fan games. It's made by this one developer who has a very specific style in terms of video games, and they took and distilled all of that mechanics in a very twitchy game that requires a lot of actions and moving and planning, and they put it all into a turn-based kind of pseudo real-time strategy board game, and it's really cool that they were able to do that.
Yep. Bullet Hearts is a very niche game, but either way, if you have a chance to get the tabletop version of it, or if you want to spring for the physical version, it is a very interesting game, and that's one that I would highly recommend. So now you got your playtest in. What's your next step? Make sure to iterate on your game. That doesn't necessarily mean change the entire thing. It doesn't mean change just one little thing. Make sure that you change your game enough so that it plays differently from the first time. That doesn't mean that you need to wipe the slate clean.
And try to have an idea of what to look out for. You should try to be able to make a hypothesize what will change or what should I try to look out for as a result of the things that I'm tweaking. Because if you're just going in completely blind, you're just like, all right, let's just try this out and play the game and see what's happening. The other thing that's important while you're playtesting, do not always try to play to win. Sometimes you just want to try to play from other perspectives and you just want to try to test out mechanics. Do not always try to play as if you're trying to win the game. There are some useful points for doing so. You know, sometimes you just want to try to emulate what actual play will feel like competitively, etc. But that's another thing. Starting off, I would think about that.
Right. And as far as wanting feedback from your opponent or your playtester, I would recommend try not to keep any of that in actual gameplay at all. Just try to keep your mouth shut on asking them things about the game while they're playing, because that can drastically change their position on how they think of the game. Try to ease them in on the mechanics and don't push things in front of them.
And definitely, it's always tempting to do it, but try not to become an alpha gamer and give advice to players or tell people what they should be doing, or even comment, hey, that was an inoptimal play. It's going to be very annoying to the players. Some players they want to learn the game themselves. They want to fall. They want to pick themselves back up. They want to go, oh, okay, I now understand what's going on here, etc., etc. Let people organically learn the game.
And having those oh, okay moments is even more important if your game is a simple design, but they take it wrong, because that means that you have more information on, okay, this probably doesn't work. I need to change it somehow. And post-game feedback is one of the most important steps to figuring out your audience. If you're playing with a player that doesn't normally play your kinds of games, then their feedback might not be as important to your specific topic, but make sure that you take their ideas in mind, because they can further bring out flavors of your game that you didn't think were there before.
Or they can give you a new avenue to consider, how can I convince these types of players to try the game?
Yeah. So without further ado, that has been us, Team Emerald Fire, me, Emerald Drago, and him, Hellfire Bam. We will both be hopefully recording again next week or possibly bi-weekly. We haven't decided on a solid time schedule, but it seems like this is going to be a bi-weekly process. Any games that we have mentioned in this recording are in the description or in a comment in the description, and any timestamps to specific places where we had discussions are also in the description, along with a link to our Discord server. Any place that you might have found this, that's great. Be sure to go over our Discord to see any discussions that we have that might be interesting for specific game designs that you want to make, and feel free to contact either of us. I am usually awake at ridiculous times at night for Eastern, and Hellfire is sometimes available for brief discussions. We are both very busy playtesting our own games and sometimes playtesting other games, but we try to get as much communal discussion happening as we can. So we will both see you next time.